The topic of today's video was suggested by one of my subscribers. If you have any topics, themes, or cases that you would like me to cover in a future video, let me know in the comment section. The first entry in this list of villages that died for France is Beaumont-en-Verdunois, which dates all the way back to the year 324 CE. In the early Middle Ages, the village paid tithes to the abbess of Jouvigny, but they were eventually freed from her rule. The village has an extensive history of becoming involved in conflicts. The 30 Years' War was a conflict between Catholics and Protestants that began in the Holy Roman Empire and ravaged Europe between the years 1618 and 1648. After Ferdinand II rose to power in 1619, he forced his citizens to practice Catholicism, which violated the Peace of Augsburg. The Peace of Augsburg allowed princes to choose their own religion, but Ferdinand II wanted total control. Starting in 1635, various groups of Hungarian, Polish, and Swedish troops marched through the region, burning down villages and slaughtering their inhabitants. The people of Beaumont took refuge in the nearby castle at Ornez, but an epidemic broke out and killed 430 people. In 1815, Beaumont was invaded by Prussians, then the Germans invaded in 1870. However, the most devastating conflict involving the town occurred during World War I. On February 21st of 1916, German forces were advancing on Verdun and the Battle of Bois de Quarez took place. The French colonel ordered the survivors of the battle to retreat to Beaumont, but the Germans had superior artillery. Their infantry managed to capture Beaumont on February 24th. However, the French troops who had hidden inside the village mounted a resistance, using machine guns to mow down German soldiers. It was the Germans' turn to retreat, but they began shelling the village after they escaped. This effectively turned Beaumont into a pile of rubble. From August 20th to 26th of 1917, French troops partially recaptured the village, but the German infantry firmly held on to several defensive positions. The French began their own shelling efforts, which further devastated Beaumont. On October 8th of 1918, American forces arrived and occupied the village, putting an end to the violence. The former residents of Beaumont were excited to return home and start rebuilding, but they soon came to realize that this would not be possible. The village was inside of a red zone, meaning that there were still explosive devices that had not yet been detonated in the area. In addition, farming was out of the question because the groundwater had been heavily contaminated as a result of the fighting. They were able to build a memorial amongst the ruins of the village in 1925, but there haven't been any permanent residents of Beaumont since the First World War. The village of Fleury Bezonvaux was a French community of 422 people that was located about 40 kilometers away from the German border. The village was caught in the crossfire of World War I and became a scene of horror. By September of 1914, after the First Battle of the Marne, the front line of French troops became entrenched to the north of the village. Fleury became part of the Verdun region in 1915, and this region ended up being a major battleground. On February 21st of 1916, German General Falkenhayn launched an operation against the French in the Verdun region. The Battle of Verdun began, and it was one of the largest and bloodiest clashes of the entire war. The village was bombarded and the civilians evacuated. On February 25th, the French fort Douaumont was captured by German forces and Fleury was exposed to heightened pressure from the enemy. The French continued to be pushed back and they lost another fortified position on June 7th. Fleury became the setting of grenade battles and the village was falling apart from the explosions. Between June and August, Fleury changed hands between the French and Germans 16 times. On July 11th of 1916, the Germans captured a munitions store in Fleury, but the French weren't done just yet. They received orders to retain their positions and counterattack with any resources they had left, and they did just that. The ruins of Fleury were finally retaken on August 18th by the Colonial Infantry Regiment of Morocco, and they used the village as a base of operations for recapturing the fortified positions they had previously lost. The French had been victorious, but their success had come at a high price. They had lost many soldiers in the Battle of Verdun, and the village itself lay in ruins. In the years immediately following the Battle of Verdun, there were hundreds of thousands of bodies scattered across the region. Many of them were impossible to identify. Construction of a monument began on August 20th of 1920 and the memorial cemetery was officially opened on June 23rd of 1929. The cemetery houses the remains of 130,000 French and German soldiers who perished in the battle. In addition, there is a section for Muslim soldiers that faces Mecca. Fleury was not the only village in the Verdun region that was wiped out by the fighting. Bezonvaux was located at the foot of a hill along the Meuse, and it was caught in the crossfire of the German offensive on Fort Douaumont. The village itself was of little to no strategic interest to either army, but war doesn't discriminate. In September of 1914, the French held the front in the general area around Bezonvaux, and the Germans began shelling their lines. On February 24th of 1916, the nearby village of Ornez was dragged into the conflict when the Germans attacked. The French garrison evacuated Ornez and fled to Bezonvaux. They set up makeshift defensive positions along the route to the village, but the Germans took out each one as they advanced. Finally, at approximately 5 p.m. on February 25th, the Germans flooded the streets of Bezonvaux. This resulted in close-quarters combat between houses, and the Germans ended up capturing the village after killing almost all the defenders. On October 24th, the French launched an attack that recaptured 3 villages as well as Fort Douaumont. The French leadership considered using the same tactics from this effort for a future assault, and they chose December 15th as their date of attack. On December 10th, they began an artillery barrage to soften up the German defenses, and on the 15th, the French stormed the German lines. By the next day, French forces were focused on taking back Bezonvaux, and they succeeded. However, the destruction of the village was devastating, and the civilians who had previously lived there had no prospect of returning home. A marker was set up nearby after the war, memorializing the line that the Germans had held so staunchly. Click the Join button to become a member today. Channel members receive exclusive content as well as early access to all my content. On June 6th of 1944, Allied forces landed their troops on the beaches at Normandy, kicking off what would later become known as D-Day. If you know anything about World War II, you know that the Allied forces won the battle, but the casualties were devastating. Nonetheless, the Allied forces had established a firm foothold in France, putting the Germans on the defensive. Following this, many German battalions, including the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, were ordered to move north to challenge the Allied advance into Europe. One of the units within the 2nd SS Panzer Division was the 4th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment Der Führer, and their commanding officer was Adolf Deichmann. Deichmann was close friends with Helmut Kampf, who was the commander of the 2nd SS Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion. 4 days after the landings at Normandy, on June 10th, Deichmann informed one of his fellow officers, Otto Weidinger, that 2 members of a French paramilitary force had told him that Kampf was being held prisoner by the French resistance in the nearby village of Oradour-sur-Glane. According to the 2 witnesses, Kampf had been captured by the Marquis du Limousin while traveling in a German army vehicle that was marked as an ambulance. Deichmann was furious that his friend had apparently been captured, so he took drastic action. His battalion sealed off the town of Oradour-sur-Glane and ordered the French locals to assemble in the village square. The civilians obeyed these orders, and the Nazis proceeded to lock the women and children in the church while they led the men away to the barns. Inside the barns, the Germans were waiting with machine guns, which they used to shoot the men in the legs. After the men were immobile, they were covered in fuel and set on fire. Only 6 of them were able to escape, and one of them was shot dead when the Nazis spotted him walking down the road. After the men were taken care of, the Nazis placed an incendiary device next to the church and ignited it. The women and children tried to escape by breaking through the windows and doors, and some of them managed to get outside, but they were immediately mowed down by machine gunners. The only survivor was a 47-year-old woman named Marguerite Roufanche, who climbed out of a back window with another woman and a child. All 3 of them were shot, but Marguerite managed to survive. She crawled to some bushes and hid overnight until she was rescued the next morning. Several days later, Deichmann allowed the survivors to bury the 643 bodies. He justified the massacre by saying it was in retaliation for the murder of Helmut Kampf, who had been burned alive alongside other German soldiers. In addition to slaughtering the locals, the Nazis ransacked the town, looting and desecrating everything they could get their hands on. A 20-year-old American B-17 navigator named Raymond Murphy was shot down over Avard, France in April of 1944, and after being hidden by the French resistance, he witnessed the aftermath of the massacre. After he was extracted from France, he wrote a report on the town that goes as follows. About 3 weeks ago, I saw a town within 4 hours bicycle ride up the Gerbeau farm where some 500 men, women, and children had been murdered by the Germans. I saw one baby who had been crucified. The massacre caused outrage, not just in the Allied forces, but also within the German military. An investigation into Dykman's actions was launched, but Dykman and many of his troops were killed during the Allied invasion of Western Europe, so the investigation was ultimately suspended. On January 12th of 1953, a military tribunal in Bordeaux heard the charges against 65 surviving Nazi soldiers who had participated in the massacre. Out of these 65 men, only 21 were present at the trial because the rest were living in Germany, which refused to extradite them. Out of the 21 present, 7 were French nationals who had joined the German Reich after the invasion of France in 1940. 6 of these 7 men claimed that the SS had forced them to join against their will. On February 11th, 19 of the men were convicted of war crimes. 5 received prison sentences and 2 were executed. This caused an uproar in France, and the French Parliament passed a law granting amnesty for any French nationals who were forced to join the German Reich. The incarcerated Frenchmen were released from prison shortly after this, which triggered protests in the area surrounding Oradour-sur-Glane. By 1958, the remaining Germans were all released. Another trial related to the massacre happened in 1983 when a platoon leader named Heinz Barth was tracked down in East Germany. He was charged with giving the order to shoot 20 men in a garage. He was sentenced to life in prison, but he was released in 1997. The last trial related to the massacre happened on January 8th of 2014 when an 88-year-old former member of the 3rd Company named Werner Christukat was charged with 25 counts of murder and hundreds of counts of accessory to murder. Christukat's attorney, Rainer Polen, stated that he admitted to being present in the village at the time of the massacre, but he denied having any direct involvement. The court dropped the case on December 9th of 2014 due to a lack of credible witnesses and documentary evidence. A new village was built northwest of the ruins after World War II, and the ruins of the old village remain as a memorial. French military general Charles de Gaulle decided that the remnants of the town would serve as a reminder of the cruelty that the Nazis were capable of.